This is Steve with wearechangect, Connecticut, and I'm here with Naomi Wolf, author of End of America and Give Me Liberty, social critic, political activist, and journalist. We're here in New Haven at the Yale Barnes Noble bookstore. Naomi, as a Yale and Rhodes scholar, Oxford graduate, consultant to Slick Willie, a.k.a. Bill Clinton, as well as Al Gore during his presidential run, what inspired you to write the books End of America and Give Me Liberty?
Thank you. Boy, well, I guess I think of myself first as a citizen, and not so much primarily as an advisor to Clinton and Gore. I mean, I was an informal advisor just to make sure that the record is correct to Clinton, and a formal advisor to Gore. But I guess what led me to write it is that I have children and I want them to grow up free. And also, I'm the daughter of Holocaust, sort of an escapee from the Holocaust, and we lost a lot of people in my family in the Holocaust. And so during the Bush era and now, when there are these turning points, well, certainly during the Bush era, before I wrote the book, I was noticing that there were parallels that seemed so familiar with some of the legislation that was being passed, the Patriot Act, stripping away of civil liberties. I recognized them from histories I had read of the early 30s. And then I went back and dug a little deeper and looked at histories of a number of times and places in history when a would-be dictator, whether on the left or the right, it doesn't really matter, sought to close a democracy or suppress a democratic uprising. And I saw that there are 10 steps that would-be dictators always take, and that we were seeing those 10 steps being put into place in America.
What does it mean to be a Rhodes Scholar, and what was your mindset back then, and how has it changed since?
What does it mean? Well, it's just an opportunity, really, so I guess it means whatever the student who's lucky enough to get that fellowship makes of it, but it means that you go to Oxford for 2 or 3 years on a scholarship for free. And so for me, it was a great opportunity to, think about class and watch I'd grown up in San Francisco, which is very egalitarian. I'd never experienced real anti-Semitism, real sexism, real classism, firsthand. And then I got to Yale and I saw some, and then I got to Oxford and I was like, whoa, there really is this structure, which is so unjust. It's better now, but it was an awakening. It was a political awakening for me.
When you outline the 10 steps to a closed society in your book and later documentary, End of America, which single fact, instance, shook you to your core, made you physically sick, and woke you up to the most damning evidence to the crimes being committed to the citizens in America and abroad?
Yeah, well, unfortunately there's so many to choose from, and even more now, because things have gotten substantially worse since I wrote The End of America. Obama has sort of consolidated a number of the worst developments of the Bush years, and it's because he's not in charge. I mean, we kind of have to get it. It's like one of the, a Latin American country during the 70s or 80s when you would have a nominal, democracy, but really it's an oligarchy or a military coup, sort of behind the scenes. So he's really not in charge anymore. And so I guess the scariest thing to me, of course, is Guantanamo and the National Defense Authorization Act, which was passed after I wrote the book, but it's, a natural outcome of what I was pointing to in the book. And Guantanamo is terrifying because, well, it's terrifying for the people who are in Guantanamo, of course, and I've been to Guantanamo and reported from there, which is a soul-chilling, transformational experience. But you can't name an example of a society that ever had used torture or, incarceration without trial, right? That didn't end up using it on its own citizens. They always start with these extreme, marginal, worst-case scenarios, the terrorists or brown people or Jews, in 1933 in Germany. And everyone's like, oh, well, okay, they're so marginal, whatever. Of course, you have to lock them up or beat them up or strip them of their rights. And then there's this mission creep, inevitably. And then you get the National Defense Authorization Act, which basically says the president can take you or me and hold us forever without charge or trial. And if you, mix that up with effective torture, which is still being used at Guantanamo with the force feedings, for instance, or, solitary confinement, which are both prohibited by Geneva Conventions because they are not humane. you get a situation that effectively crushes dissent and strips us of our, constitutional right to trial, speedy trial by jury of our peers.
Did you happen to catch that video on YouTube with Yasmin Bey, Mos Def, where they strapped him to a chair and he went through what it would take to be force-fed?
No, please, stop it, please, stop!
It was pretty chilling if you watch it, just for someone to do that. But
I just want to say, when I was at Guantanamo, 6 months after Obama was elected in 2009, a prisoner died who had been force-fed, and they were, covering up his death when I was there, like keeping it from the journalists. It's an incredibly violent process. Yeah.
It is, most definitely. You kind of touched upon this, but
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, no problem.
I can't even believe we're having this discussion at this late stage in human history, and in the United States, because they wouldn't be on hunger strike if they weren't incarcerated for 11 years without charge or trial. Like these people have never been charged, right? There are no charges. There is no trial date, and that's why they're on hunger strike. I mean, I just can't keep saying enough how dangerous and scary and wrong that is.
So why do you think we're still sitting here talking about this? How come people aren't in the streets screaming from the rooftops?
It's a really interesting question. I do think that the general awareness of these issues has really gone up a lot since we began talking about them in 2009. I mean, I do, hear people from all walks of life horrified about NSA spying, for instance. Horrified about the National Defense Authorization Act. I mean, that was a really beautiful sort of grassroots movement of people, libertarians, people on the far right, people on the far left, the 10th Amendment Center, which is, I think, libertarian right, and Bill of Rights Defense Committee, which is kind of liberal left, working together because it's just so un-American and people get it. But, well, first of all, it's hard to engage in dissent anymore in the United States because in 2011 there was an outpouring of dissent from people like Occupy and wearechangect and so on. And it was violently crushed with coordination from the Department of Homeland Security. And people were really hurt and, and beaten and, injured, and reporters were intimidated and their cameras were... I was arrested, and it was quite terrifying. I was arrested for standing on a street peacefully advising peaceful protesters about their First Amendment rights. I mean, I was arrested for obeying the law, and it's the kind of arrest where you would never want to be arrested again because they changed the direction we were going in from the precinct where the jurisdiction was of the arrest to an unknown precinct. And when you've got these renditions and you've got these unaccountable treatments of prisoners, it hasn't happened yet in the United States, but when you're in the back of a police van, and your lawyer doesn't know where you are, the protesters don't know where you are, your family doesn't know where you are, and they're like, okay, let's not take them to the third precinct, let's change our destination. It's absolutely terrifying. And when we were held in our cell for half an hour, we were threatened, by the sergeant. He said, a perfectly nice man, but, police are being made to violate the Constitution in these very, very violent ways. And he said, if you go rejoin your friends at Occupy, I wasn't even a member of Occupy, I was just a citizen, we will fingerprint you, we will, keep your bio data, it will go into a database, and, if you ever disturb the peace again, you'll be, and then he threw some, very scary charge, which I don't even remember because it was so traumatic. You'll be charged with this very scary, serious charge. And I said, well, how do I know what disturbing the peace is? I mean, how do you define that? I'm a totally nonviolent person. I believe in nonviolence, but I was arrested for being nonviolent and obeying the law. And he said, it's up to us, basically. We decide. We decide what that means. So that's a police state. So anyway, that why are people not in the streets? Because the streets are very dangerous now because of this crackdown on dissent.
So with all these intimidation tactics, and they're trying to instill fear into people so they're a little more complacent, so they'll think twice about going out in the street and raising awareness. Did it make you rethink what you were doing? And did it stop you from doing anything in the future?
Well, I mean, I'm still here talking to you. So I don't, look, this is really sad. I don't take my children to protests. You know, my parents took me to protests. My grandmother took her kids to protests because that was how you showed your patriotism. The way I grew up, that's how you show your respect for the Constitution, is through First Amendment protected freedom of assembly. You know, that's how you make your voice heard. That's how you honor the forefathers and foremothers of our country. So I don't do that anymore, you know, with my kids, because it's not safe. I don't really, I mean, I don't want to say I've changed my behavior. I think I'm more strategic, but there's certainly, okay, I don't investigate sources who contact me over the internet and offer to disclose things that might be classified information, because look at Edward Snowden, look at Julian Assange, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a terrible damage to my integrity as a reporter. I shouldn't be not following up on, you know, important leads that could be of public interest. So I guess in those ways, those are very sad damages. And when there was a lawsuit against the NDAA, I filed an amicus brief explaining how my practice as a reporter has been harmed by these assaults, the intimidation of the NDAA. But I still, you know, I still think it's important to say I still speak up because, you know, we still have some space to speak up, right? And history really does show that things get worse unless a lot of people speak up continually, and push, you know, the boundaries that they can nonviolently.
So any personal tips from your own experience on how to lose that fear so we can get more people out in the street and unified? And I also wanted to ask you about, you know, you talk about, you know, the far left, the far right, libertarians. As an author, do you think we're ever going to be able to shed those labels? Because sometimes those labels can cause prejudice and make people not want to talk to one another because they think they may have different views or beliefs than them. It's almost like divide and conquer.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I mean, you're 100% right that the gatekeepers really do try to whip up these fake divisions. I mean, sure, people have all kinds of views across the political spectrum, but you know, most people are very reasonable, and even if they, you know, decide different policy outcomes, they should be having, like, democracy depends on people having these discussions, you know, across partisan lines, across, you know, political lines, and there are very few places to do it. That's why I'm working on a democracy-building website where people can have these discussions. So I think it's happening online a lot. I think the internet does open up space for people to have these conversations. And I know there is some interesting, you know, activism going on, like the anti-NSA spying rally I went to in Washington was definitely people across the political spectrum. Having said that, you asked another question, which is how can people get over their fear? And I don't think you need to get over your fear. I think that what you need to be aware of is that it is much scarier what happens when you keep silent than it is when you speak. You know, that nothing, like history shows that when everyone keeps silent, when there's this kind of degradation of civil liberties, things get much, 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 much more terrifying very quickly. And that conversely, to put, you know, make people hopeful. I mean, there is a lot more pushback these days than there was in the past. I mean, I just read today that, there was a ruling that Guantanamo detainees can challenge their, you know, a judge ruled today that Guantanamo detainees can challenge their force feeding. And the representative for the detainees from Reprieve, this wonderful organization, said that's going to open the door to challenges of all kinds, legal challenges from the detainees. And I think that people are a little less hypnotized and a little more nervous about losing their basic freedoms. I mean, I was interested that another judge ruled yesterday that clicking your headlights to warn drivers that there's a speed trap ahead is protected First Amendment speech. So I think people are speaking up, people are waking up, and our job is to keep that going. I need to go now.
Drones, they want them in the cities of America. So if they think that you are an enemy of America in some form or fashion, or enemy of the community, they can use a drone in the cities of America. And that's what they're working towards. Overseas, they do it with impunity, but they're working on in America, so we have to stop it. We can all agree upon that, so let's work on what we can agree upon.
It's the right thing to do, and fuck the pharmaceutical companies and fuck the government, and this is how we're helping people who are in our community, and we will overgrow them eventually.